As the story unfolds, we meet Ruth Slater, who's just been let out of jail after serving time for a crime she committed. We get glimpses of her taking care of her sister Katie and the events leading to the sheriff's death. When Ruth gets out, her parole officer Vince Cross warns her not to try to fix what she did wrong. Meanwhile, the sheriff's son Keith starts following her. Ruth talks about a woodworking job, but Cross tells her it won't be easy and suggests another job. Ruth goes to a group home where the manager shows her around and introduces her to her new roommates. In another part of town, Katie, now called Catherine Malcolm, barely remembers Ruth. In a flashback, Katie is in a car crash. She wakes up in a hospital bed with her adoptive family around her. They ask if she's been taking her medicine and insist she moves back home to recover. Rachel worries that Ruth's release might be linked to Katie's accident and fears Ruth might come looking for her. Michael assures Rachel it's just a coincidence. Meanwhile, Keith tells his brother Steve about Ruth's release and where she is. He's set on revenge, but Steve tells him to let it go. Back at the group home, Ruth gets a call where someone calls her a cop killer. Ruth hangs up and finds one of her roommates going through her bag, breaking the no-stealing rule. Ruth confronts her and kicks her out, finding an old photo of Katie in her bag. Then we see Keith at home looking after his sick mother. Meanwhile, Steve is preparing to leave for the day when his wife calls him back. He kisses his daughter and wife, Hannah, revealing that both brothers lead unhappy and unfulfilling lives. Ruth wakes up in her bunk bed, her thoughts drifting to Katie. In a flashback, Ruth is seen yelling at a bank employee who has come to repossess their farmhouse. The sheriff arrives to keep the peace, but soon he is lying on the ground in a pool of blood. In the present day, Liz and John Ingram are the current owners of the renovated farmhouse, living there with their two sons, Ryan and Daniel. During a family argument, Liz is interrupted by the electrician, who discovers a pair of baby shoes hidden in the wall. He mentions that some people leave shoes in walls to ward off evil spirits. Liz instructs him to put them back and then leaves for work. On her first day at a carpentry job, Ruth finds out there's no spot available. With few options, she ends up working at a fish factory recommended by Cross. After a long day, she cleans up and heads to the library. There, she tries to find info about Katie, but without knowing what she looks like or details about her adoption, it's tough. However, she spots an article about the farmhouse being sold and decides to visit. Memories of Katie as a child flood back as she travels there. She vividly remembers the day when the sheriff offered them shelter, but she refused, knowing Katie would be taken away if they stayed. Inside the farmhouse, Liz notices Ruth and asks John to check on her. Ruth claims she did some work there and vaguely answers Liz's questions about the previous owners. When John mentions the shoes found in the wall, Ruth denies knowing about them, but her gaze gives her away. Overwhelmed with memories, Ruth leaves abruptly. John offers her a ride to the bus station, and Ruth opens up about her past with the house, admitting it was the last place she lived with her sister before Katie was put in foster care and adopted. John, feeling sympathetic, offers to assist Ruth in finding her sister. At Katie's home, she's looked after by Michael and Rachel. When her parents leave for work, Katie tells Emily she stopped taking her medication and has been having flashbacks of a woman she can't identify. Emily suggests they search for her, but Katie is hesitant to confront her painful past. Ruth goes back to the group home and notices a chapel being renovated. Inside, she learns they're not hiring, but after showcasing her carpentry skills, the foreman changes his mind. When Cross checks in, he asks if she mentioned her criminal history. Ruth didn't, and expresses frustration that her past shouldn't define her everywhere she goes. Cross reminds her that being labeled a cop killer will stick with her and she needs to accept it. Meanwhile, John finds out about Ruth's past from messages she left, assuming he did a background check. Ruth explains her story and asks for his help, just wanting to meet Katie's parents to make sure her sister is okay. At Katie's house, Liz asks the contractor about the previous owners, surprised by her lack of knowledge. The contractor reveals that Ruth and Katie's father committed suicide, and Ruth shot the sheriff when the bank came to evict them. When John returns home, Liz tells him what she found out, but he already knows and has decided to help Ruth find her sister. Meanwhile, at a retirement party, Steve sees Hannah flirting with other cops and his brother. When an old friend asks for Ruth's work address for his brother, Steve refuses, sparking an argument with Keith. Reflecting on their troubled past, Steve visits his sick mother, then secretly visits Ruth at the chapel. After she leaves, Steve goes through her things and finds a photo of Katie, changing his perspective. Later, Steve reconciles with Keith, acknowledging Ruth's impact on their difficult past. Meanwhile, Michael receives a letter from John, now representing Ruth, requesting a meeting. Rachel convinces Michael to consider it for Katie's sake, unaware that Emily is listening in. At work, Ruth bonds with her coworker Blake at a diner, opening up about her past. Blake is shocked, and Ruth leaves, holding back tears. The next day, another coworker attacks her, revealing her father was a cop, further isolating Ruth. She pushes away Blake's attempts to talk. By the water, Ruth meets Cross and brushes off his lecture, insisting she's changed. Cross arranges a meeting with Katie's parents, giving Ruth hope. After school, Emily searches for the letter she overheard her parents discussing. Meanwhile, Ruth confronts the Malcolms and learns they hid her letters from Katie. Accusing them of destroying her letters, Ruth pleads for them to tell Katie about her. Back home, Emily reads Ruth's old letters and is deeply moved. Meanwhile, Katie is haunted by a memory, crying alone in front of a mirror. The next day at work, Blake apologizes to Ruth, revealing he was also recently released from prison. He explains their relationship is forbidden due to their parole terms. On her way home, Emily calls Ruth, expressing her desire to meet after reading her letters. The next morning, Steve, who has been watching Ruth, follows her. Emily arrives at the botanical park and listens as Ruth reminisces about Katie's childhood. Before leaving, Emily reveals that Katie is a pianist and has a rehearsal at the local auditorium later that day. Excited, Ruth calls John for legal advice to ensure the meeting goes smoothly. Meanwhile, Steve, who has followed Ruth, mistakes Emily for Katie and finds her address. At home, Steve comforts his baby and discovers Keith and Hannah together, which angers him. He storms out and goes to his mother's house, taking Keith's gun. Unable to reach John, Ruth rushes to the farmhouse to find him. Instead, she encounters Liz, who is furious and doesn't understand why John is giving Ruth another chance. Ruth insists Katie was only 5 years old. Flashbacks reveal it was actually 5-year-old Katie who accidentally shot the sheriff. Learning the truth, Liz sympathizes with Ruth and offers to drive her to the recital. On the way, Ruth remembers her final moments with her sister, expressing her love. When they arrive at the recital, Ruth gets a call from Steve, claiming he has Katie at gunpoint and instructing her to meet him at the harbor. Ruth pleads with him not to hurt Katie, but he coldly replies that life moves on. Ruth tells Liz about the new meeting spot, and they head to the harbor. When they arrive, Liz starts to feel suspicious. Ruth confides that someone has taken Katie and goes to meet Steve, while Liz stays in the car and calls for help. When Ruth and Steve meet, she sees Emily on the ground and begs for her safety. Steve threatens Emily with his gun. Meanwhile, Katie is playing the piano. Ruth shares her regret with Steve, explaining that life doesn't just move on. It leaves behind the people you care about. Struggling with his emotions, Steve can't bring himself to harm Emily. Ruth helps Emily and prepares to shield her from harm. With Steve still holding the gun, they have a tense standoff. Ruth remembers when she took the blame for Katie. Eventually, Ruth walks out with her hands up and is arrested alongside Steve. At the recital, Michael receives a call. Katie finishes her performance and recalls Ruth's comforting touch. Cross arrives and has Ruth released into his custody. As Ruth walks away with Vince, she sees Katie approaching. They share a heartfelt hug, and Katie finally feels complete in Ruth's embrace. Share your thoughts on the movie in the comments below.